Hello and welcome to this webinar on climate change and peace in the Arab region and implications on sustainable peace and development. This webinar is being co-organized by the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations in association with the UNESCO Peace Chair and the Center for Climate Studies at Manipal Academy of Higher Education. We have with us a very special guest all the way from Egypt who will be talking to us about climate change, peace, development, from a very holistic perspective, and how does it affect a region as complex as West Asia and North Africa, which constitutes the Arab region and beyond that, in fact. So thank you so much, Salma. Salma Kadry, who is joining us from Egypt today, for joining us. So before I start the proceedings, I would like to first invite Dr. Nandkishore, the head of Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, to deliver the welcome remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Dhanashree. I think it's a great occasion for us, again, reviving of a small gap UNESCO Peace Cheer activity again, which we have been regularly doing. And we had decided from the beginning itself that we wanted to go beyond just the South Asian region, but we wanted to go to all those regions which are affected, taking into consideration conflict, climate, then many other aspects to it, from the peace process to everything. I think from that perspective, this particular talk is very, very important, and it also covers a wide gamut of area for us because we have used the word Arab. So when that naturally brings in West Asia, North Africa. And to Salma, we use West Asia because for us it's West Asia, though it's not Middle East for us. So we in India tend to use the region as West Asia, North Africa. That's why probably this was much better for us to use Arab as such, because it provides an identity. It gives that identity of nationhood, which is beyond the borders that are restricted by the modern imagination of the state borders and the sovereignty component. Now, though I'm not an expert on climate change specific to your region, at least I've been following certain very important debates and the region itself from other perspective, including terrorism and many other components on identity to a lot of other things. Over a decade now, if we have seen, the region itself has witnessed very serious escalation, because we also look at the type of water crisis that's coming up, the issues associated with rivers and many other things, the type of drought cycles that has been witnessed by the region has been phenomenal. If you look at, they say, I came across this particular report that said from the IPCC that says 40% of the people in the Arab region have already been exposed to droughts and other climatic disasters, leading to food security, insecurity, loss of livelihoods, and displacement of millions of people. Now, this being the region itself being considered as world's most water scarce as well as food import dependent region, it contains water stressed countries. There are major issues with regard to, as I mentioned already, the river water sharing to many other things. I think it has also suffered from an increased intensity and frequency of extreme weather events, including wildfires in Lebanon, because that's also a country that I look at the domestic politics and the type of debates that happen there. In Syria, flash floods in the country that you hail from, Egypt, then Jordan, Oman, and then Saudi Arabia and many other places. I think there are series of issues that have been happening, which also has led to issues on increase in seawater intrusion into coastal aquifers, and then rise of sea level, groundwater overexploitation, to lot of other things, and this has consequences to everybody, but there are specific outcomes of which affect women, the poor, and the marginalized community. I'm sure you are the best to speak about it. So on behalf of Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and the UNESCO Peace Chair located at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, we have a pleasure to invite you, and this is the first time you're interacting with the students of Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. Slowly we are expanding our own horizon, and I'm sure we will have many more interactions. We'll have some collaborative works, and we should be able to have some of our students who are keen to work on climate change and peace negotiations, to a lot of other things, to intern with scholars like you. So we look forward to hearing you. And once again, a very, very warm welcome, and thank you for accepting our invitation and accepting to deliver this very important lecture as part of the body of knowledge. Over to you, Dr. Dhanashree.
Thank you so much, sir. So that pretty much lays the foundation for today's lecture. He covered a lot of issues which the region, the Arab region, is grappling with, and I'm sure Salma is going to touch upon most of them. So I would like to introduce Salma Kadry now very briefly. Salma Kadry is a climate security and development program officer at the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution, Peacekeeping and Peace Building, and a member of the Climate Security Expert Network, which is coordinated by Adelphi, a Berlin-based think tank. Her work focuses on designing and managing trainings, convening and researching activities on the climate, security, and development nexus in Africa and the broader WANA region. Her research interests include climate risk assessments, climate policy, and programming in conflict-affected areas, as well as climate and peace-building nexus. Salma holds a master's degree summa cum laude in global studies from Wrocław University, Poland, and Ghent University, Belgium. Her thesis focused on Egypt's energy politics post-2013, where she examined two major energy reforms, namely the phasing out of the fossil fuel subsidy program and the shift to renewable energy. Prior to doing her master's, Salma was a researcher at CCCPA. She contributed to the execution of its project on mainstreaming gender in peacekeeping and peace building. She also contributed to the development of the first of its kind training manual and toolkit on mainstreaming gender in peacemaking, peacekeeping and peace building in the WANA region. So thank you so much, Salma. As you can see, she has a wide range of experience, and she covers a whole gamut of issues ranging from environmental to economic to social. I would like to now invite Salma to speak with the audience, and after that we will take the question and answers. So yeah, over to you. I'll start sharing the presentation now from my side.
Thank you very much for the great introduction and for extending the invitation. I'm very happy to be with you here today. And thank you also for setting the stage and providing a good overview of the issues that we'll be discussing today in the presentation.
Yeah, just give me a second. Yeah, are you able to see it?
Not yet. Okay. Yeah, now it's working.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So now I'll be giving now I'll be giving a short, presentation on climate change in the Arab region and what are the possible and already ongoing implications on sustainable peace and development. So next slide. Allow me at first, I think it would be useful to provide an overview of the impacts and manifestations of climate change in the different regions and areas across the Arab region. And it's interesting to see how different areas are affected differently by those impacts and manifestation. And most of the information I'll provide is based on the recent report of the International Panel on Climate Change. So the IPCC projects that Middle East and North Africa will be one of the world's regions hit hardest by climate change in the 21st century. And this is particularly due to extreme heat, droughts, and aridity conditions. So if we look at the coastal region around the Mediterranean Sea, particularly in North Africa and the coastline between Egypt and Turkey, in this area there has already observed progressive intensification of droughts. And projections for this sub-region with more warming include further aridity and drought, and this is due to less precipitation, which enhances or create favorable, let's say, conditions for fire weather, and this encourages the occurrence of wildfires, and we have seen in Lebanon and Turkey earlier this year. So these projected outcomes are also coupled with significant sea level rise by mid-century at global warming that exceeds 2 degrees Celsius. So we see that this coastal line, it faces issues of droughts, of less precipitation, and also it's exposed to sea level rise. But then if we look at the Sahara region, the Sahara sub-region, which extends from Mauritania to Sudan and from the Sahel to the north of the continent, excluding the coastal areas of the Mediterranean, while the surface temperature of this region is traditionally and historically, it's an arid region. It's also expected to face heavy precipitation and is likely to occur with greater frequency. This intensity of precipitation activity will also generate more flooding events in the region. And then if we look, so this region is exposed to heavy rainfalls and floodings. But if we look at another subregion, which is the Arabian Peninsula, and this, I mean, primarily include the Gulf countries and Yemen, and the Western Central Asia sub-region, which is mostly centered on Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. For both of these sub-regions, future warming will generally translate to more precipitation. However, while this trend mostly holds true in either sub-region for winter precipitation, the opposite occurs for Western Central Asia during the summer. So higher global temperature will result in reduced summer precipitation for the Western Central Asia sub-region. In addition, portions of the Western Central Asia with mountain snowpack that feeds into regional rivers during the spring snow melt season will see a reduction in the amount of annual snowpack, with reductions being larger at higher elevation. Then lastly, if we look at the Arabian Sea, we see that it has experienced warming at a rate that is faster than the global average of ocean warming, and sea surface temperatures will continue to rise with higher levels of global warming. And again, the continued warming of the oceans will contribute or fuel sea level rise, which will affect the coastal lands and the coastal areas. So this is just a quick overview of how different areas and regions across the WANA region face different types of climate impacts and manifestations. Next slide, please. Yes, now I also thought it would be useful to just walk you quickly through the climate security debate and concepts, and how the conceptualization and understanding of climate security has evolved over the years. If we look back, I mean, in the 1990s, the conceptualization of climate change, natural resource-based conflicts have already emerged, but this early understanding, let's say, it was rather simplistic, reductionist of the relationship between climate change and conflict, and they assumed, or there was an assumption, that there could be a direct or causal link between climate change and conflict. Again, where climate change causes competition over scarce natural resources and increases vulnerability due to a higher frequency of natural hazards and violent conflict. But then if we look at in late 2000s, there was a second school of literature that emerged, which stressed that climate change factors do not cause violent conflict, but rather affect the parameters that are sometimes important in generating violent conflict. So here there has been criticism of this causal link between climate change and conflict, and another understanding of these issues have emerged. But nowadays in the debate, we see a lot how climate change is being increasingly understood as a threat multiplier, meaning that when climate-related threats happen, such as droughts, heavy rainfall, and floods, that they feed on and exacerbate existing threats and vulnerabilities, and they could actually magnify these issues. So they can magnify conflict threats and dynamics. And now we're even shifting towards a risk multiplier. So not just a threat multiplier, but a risk multiplier. And here the difference, meaning that climate-related threats, again, drought, sea level rise, and others, that they do not only exacerbate existing threats, but they could contribute to a cascade of risks. They have, let's say, a cascade or a multifaceted risks or consequences, possible negative consequences that they could cause. So it's not just about exacerbating or feeding on issues that are in place and threats in place, but also they can bring many other risks and possible negative consequences. And lastly, another also widely term used nowadays is climate-related security and development risks. And this, again, the use of this term, it aims to have a more, let's say, broad and more holistic understanding of climate change and its possible consequences, that it does not only affect security issues, but it also affects the development landscape, and to look at how these issues, they all relate to one another. But one thing that I think it's important to mention, that again, many of these conceptions, they are propagated by institutions from the global north. And I think this is again a knowledge gap, and there is much more that needs to be done to assess these concepts against the realities that are lived on the ground in countries in the global south and in the Arab region. So again, how do we have a more, let's say, an Arab-owned agenda of these issues, a more contextualized knowledge and understanding of these issues, where again, people that are at the front lines and affected communities could, voice again their own experiences, needs of these issues. And this is particularly specific to the Arab region. There are much, let's say, focus given to Sub-Saharan Africa than the Arab region on these issues. So there is a definite knowledge gap here. Maybe one thing I came across, there was a regional climate security stakeholder dialogue that was organized by the League of Arab States and the Arab Water Council. And I think this was the first of its kind. It happened in December in 2020. It was the first of its kind to bring the main stakeholders on these issues in the Arab region. And they sort of came of a possible understanding or definition of climate security, which I think would be maybe useful to read it out for you. So the definition or understanding that they came up with is that climate security is a new concept used to describe and understand the combined impacts of climate-related change on natural resources, ecosystems, socio-economic development, and political stability of a country, and therefore of a region. It aims to emphasize the catalytic effect of climate-related change as a risk multiplier that can lead to multiple threats on human welfare, economic resilience, and national security that most immediately affect vulnerable groups and that necessitate integrated cross-sectoral mitigation and adaptation efforts. So it's interesting, again, to see some of the terminologies are already some concept that I have mentioned, but again, this is like the only conceptualization that I found that came from Arab stakeholders of these issues. So now I'll focus on 4 specific, let's say, climate security development interlinkages, which is the issue of water insecurity and food insecurity, which is very much related to water insecurity, livelihood loss, and migration and displacement. So we look at, let's say, these 4 trends, and I'll be providing specific examples from specific Arab countries, given that all of these issues vary and differ in one country to the other. So maybe let's focus, zoom in on the issue of water, of climate change and water insecurity. The next slide, please. So the MENA region, I mean, it's reported to be the most water scarce region in the world. And out of the 17 most stressed countries in the world, 11 of them are in the MENA region. So while the region is home to 5% of the world's population, the region only possesses about 1% of the world's total renewable freshwater resources. Agriculture, the sector that is most consuming of water, accounts for more than 80% in some of the countries of the region. And additional factors contributing to water scarcity including conflict, especially in Syria, Yemen, Sudan, and Iraq, migration of people from rural to urban areas, population growth, poor water management, and deteriorating water infrastructures, and also issues with water governance and how the water is being managed. And in this graph, we see what's the trend in fresh water resources per capita in Arab countries from the 1960s and how it has been declining till today in 2021 up to 2050. Next slide, please. So now I'll actually zoom in on the case of Iraq, which faces, I mean, it faces a serious water scarcity problem. I mean, first I'll provide you with more context on how climate change is affecting the water resources in Iraq. I mean, Iraq is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change impacts in the region. And this is particularly due to its arid and downstream location. So that throughout the last decades, I mean, the country has witnessed rising temperatures, variability and unpredictability of rainfall precipitation. And this has caused recurrent droughts in late 1990s, but also in mid-2000s, heat waves, erratic rainfall. And Iraq also depends on precipitation outside of its borders for half of its water supply. So this again makes it a very vulnerable to the changes in precipitation levels. And if we look in southern of Iraq, given that it's a downstream country and the water becomes very low Iraq has main two rivers, Euphrates and Tigris, and they come together, they meet together in Shatt al-Arab. And the water becomes very low at the very southern part of Iraq. And with the sea level rise in the Persian Gulf, this has led to intrusion of soil in Shatt al-Arab and groundwater resources in the southern part of Iraq. This increases the salinity of water and causes serious damages to the surrounding lands, which many of the communities depend on for agriculture and fishery. So flash floods, droughts, extreme weather events, all of these put additional stress on Iraq's water infrastructure, which is already very much damaged and face a lot of problems. I mean, this consequently affects industries, I mean, negatively affects industries and livelihood activities. It increases the risk of food insecurity, water-borne diseases, particularly among children, disrupts education and healthcare services. So this is on one hand to look on how climate change have impacted the water resources and the rivers, the two rivers of Iraq. But on the other hand, we can also look at how conflict in Iraq has affected the water resources and water infrastructure. And I'll bring examples from how the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant ISIL, how they used and controlled water infrastructure for, let's say, political gains or their aims for territorial expansion. So they exerted control over critical water resources and key water infrastructure. And this was manifested in two ways. First, that ISIL has controlled dams by holding water behind them, diverting water flows, and temporarily cutting off supply of water. And this led to the drainage of certain communities. In parallel, it released water to dams and caused flooding to drown government-controlled territories or impede the movement of government forces by flooding, by releasing dams and flooding some areas. Second, I mean, they also contaminated water resources, and this has rendered them unsustainable for drinking, for agriculture and livestock farming. So the utilization of water resources for political or military goals has had devastating consequences on Iraq's water infrastructure. I mean, the Ministry of Water Resources estimate the cost of direct damage to the water infrastructure at $600 million. So it's important to look at how the conflict have affected the water resources and infrastructure in Iraq, and how does this undermine the resilience of communities in dealing with climate-related threats, and that it even exacerbated further the water stress in Iraq. So these are interesting linkages to look at. So maybe now let me shift to the second, let's say, interlinkage or trend that we'll be looking at, which is climate change and food insecurity. Yes, thank you. So again, food insecurity is another major concern for the region, and I mean, specifically was mentioned in the introductory remarks of how Arab countries depend on imports for around 30 to 35% of their food supply. For instance, cereals constitute a major component in the diets of the people in the Arab region, and cereal import dependency is over 50% and by far the highest globally. These hardships is further amplified by volatility in prices and international trade prices of grains and other essential food goods or products. Also, internal trade barriers in individual countries make it difficult for, again, poor and vulnerable communities to have access to food supplies. So the greater a society's reliance on basic food imports, the more the poor will be at risk of food insecurity whenever there are disruptions in trade or issues of price volatility. So on one hand, the region is highly dependent, let's say, on food imports, and it's facing a deepening water scarcity, and this certainly has a direct impact on the agriculture sector, which is already largely depend on fresh water resources, and on average, the agriculture sector claims 85% of total water withdrawals in the region. So the availability and security of water is very much linked to food security and to the agriculture sector in the region. And so there is this mix of dependency, which again makes the region also susceptible to any changes that might happen. I mean, even climate-induced changes that might happen elsewhere. And again, all sort of trade disruptions that might take place. And on the other hand, there is also a jeopardized food production due to the changes in water availability, both in terms of rainfalls or fresh water resources. So maybe let's again zoom in on the case of Sudan to see how the issue of food insecurity is happening or affecting Sudan. So in Sudan, agriculture accounts for around 1/3 of Sudan's GDP and employs around 80% of the labor force. So 80% of people work in the agriculture sector. Agriculture is mostly rain-fed, and it's therefore it's very sensitive to changes in level of precipitation and rainfall. The amount of rainfall, the timing of the rainfall. So this again, climate vulnerability. It's a key factor in Sudan's economy, livelihoods, and food security. If we look at the north of Sudan, we'll see that pastoralism, I mean, as a livelihood activity, it's most present in the north. while systems are more prevalent in the south, where the rainy season is more reliable and longer and heavier. So food security in Sudan is tightly linked again to agriculture production. However, 60 to 75% of households are reliant on food purchase, and food markets are rather fragmented in Sudan. Also, physical and economic access to food and the trading of agriculture goods, so market access are also important factors. So agriculture labor is also an important source of income for poor households. So such changes in production will have a secondary impact on both labor opportunities and ability of employers to pay for the labor required in the case of reduced crop yields or crop production. So again, this reduces income and thus also access to food. So it's also important to see these impacts or possible impacts on the agriculture sector and food security in light of Sudan's resource-based conflicts as a result of, again, competition over scarce and limited resources, whether it's water, pasture, or livestock, particularly in areas where population is concentrated around such resources. So these conflicts have led to displacement, aggravated food insecurity as a result of reduced access to markets and loss of livelihoods. So it's important to look at these impacts in light, again, of a history of conflicts over scarce natural resources and how this might contribute to social tensions or conflict between communities that depend heavily on these resources. So the third trend that we'll be looking at, or main issue, is the issue of livelihood loss. Climate change, I mean, as we have seen from the issue of food security and dependency on agriculture for livelihoods and employment. So definitely, I mean, changes in agriculture and other natural resource-based, let's say, livelihoods, this increases a lot the risk of people losing their livelihoods, losing their sources of income and their employment. So if we look at the case of Somalia, for instance, next slide. Yes, and so we'll see that in Somalia's National Adaptation Program of Action on Climate Change, NAPA, it was referred that the extreme weather events that are associated with loss of livelihoods and increased poverty. And this has been also further highlighted in a recent report that was released in January 2020. The federal government of Somalia, the African Union, and the UN. It was a joint assessment, a joint threat assessment of Somalia, and it again referred to the impact of extreme weather events on livelihood loss. And also, I mean, there are records of droughts, and Somalia have been facing recurrent droughts that they contribute to fueling herder-farmer conflicts between settled communities and livestock herders who compete over fewer resources and degraded pasture. So loss of income from agriculture and pastoralism can also increase the risks of violent conflict, and people believe that they have less to lose from using violence or joining armed groups when their livelihoods are threatened. And then if you also briefly look at Iraq, which is a very different also context to look at, and specifically in rural communities where women usually play a big role in subsistence agriculture. We find that mostly male farmers work in agriculture fields such as wheat and barley, while women perform farming activities in nearby groves. So this includes the collection of dates, the planting of vegetables. These products are usually sold in the village's market to provide a small income for the family, or this also subsistence farming could be used for feeding the family itself, for the food security at a household level. So again, climate, induced changes, including the droughts, erratic water supply, land degradation, they have affected the farming activities, and this has made it harder for women to secure an income, provide basic, again, commodities, food commodities for their families. Now let me shift to the last a trend that we'll be looking at, which is the climate change, migration and displacement, and how, again, climate change, which is very interesting area to look, how does it impact the movement of people and the mobility of people. So according to a new report by the World Bank, it was just recently released. It's called the Groundswell Report, and they had a chapter that focuses on the MENA region. According to a report that in North Africa alone, internal climate migrants could number as many as 19.3 million. Climate out migration will occur in areas where livelihood systems are increasingly compromised and threatened by climate change impact. While climate in migration, the regions where people will migrate to, will occur in areas with better livelihood opportunities. But again, evidence shows that climate change is not the sole driver for migration. It's usually, again, it's multifactorial, and there are let's say, drivers involved in people's decision to migrate or not. So some people, migrate to seek better opportunities, reacting to climate change impacts on their livelihoods, their health, or their food security, while others are displaced involuntarily as they flee destruction caused by sudden onset disasters and extreme weather events that are often amplified by climate change. So while migration can be an important economic driver, it's usually used as a main coping strategy by communities that are affected by climate change. But it can also create tensions with host communities, with the receiving communities, particularly if in these receiving communities there are already limited resources and capacities, and let's say infrastructures are not in a good shape. So we can see this could cause social tensions, particularly, let's say, in receiving communities. So migration is not monocausal, and there are different, let's say, migratory patterns. And next slide, please. Thank you. So again, now I'll look a little bit in the case of Iraq to showcase how, again, there are different migratory patterns, and people don't move in the same, let's say, migratory routes or directions. So on one hand, there is evidence that rural families in Iraq do move to other rural communities, and there are data from the IOM that suggests that most families displaced by Iraq's water crisis in 2019 moved from one rural area to another rural area, and nearly a quarter of whom moved to other villages. Social capital, including family, tribal connections, they're usually a significant factor in shaping families' decision to move, largely on the basis of livelihood opportunities. And social capital is generally an important factor that shapes people's ability to cope and adapt with challenges. And in patriarchal societies, men are often placed in a more favorable and better connected positions, which allows them to find better opportunities and to move easier. But on the other hand, other families move to urban areas and usually reside on the outskirts of urban clusters, so not inside the city, but in the outskirts of the city, or in lands that are registered as agriculture, so they can live in informal settlements around the city. So it's interesting to see how, again, people move, that there is no one direction or migratory route that people take, but they are diverse. And when people are faced with a certain, let's say, crisis or extreme weather event, they don't move in the same way. Next slide, please. So, okay, I can see that, mindful of time, maybe I'll go through this very quickly for 5 minutes. But I thought it would be important. Again, these sorts of concepts and principles I have here, I mean, they don't apply only on the Arab region, but I think they're important to look at, or they should be guiding principles or guide our thinking of how do we better assess issues of climate change and its possible security and development implications. So first, the issue of causality versus correlation. So we shouldn't be focusing on proving a causal link between, if let's say a drought happened, then migration will take place, and we try to prove this causal link. However, we should focus more on the relationship. So the relationship between climate change and food insecurity, climate change and livelihood loss. To think if a drought, let's say, hit a certain community, how could this affect, or how might this lead to livelihood loss, to the movement of people, to social tensions between communities that depend heavily on these resources? So this is, again, an important guiding, let's say, concept to look at, of the relationships and how these issues relate to one another or might lead to one another. And this brings us to this idea of non-linearity and dynamism, that there's no linear relationship, let's say, between rainfall, like, let's say, heavy rainfalls and floods, and the displacement of people. But we should actually look, it's a much more dynamic process. I mean, there is no direct link, it's not monocausal, but there is a lot of other factors and issues that are at play, and we need to understand it in its complexity and how these issues affect one another, or factors affect one another. And third, I think it's always important to remember that there is agency and that there is human decisions, and that, again, these crises not necessarily, so climate change does not need by any means to lead to conflict, because there are agency, because human takes decisions. They can take decisions to intervene early on, to have preparedness plans in place. They take decisions to move or not, or how to react. So it's always important to remember that there's a human agency that's involved in all of this, and that part in shaping how these things come together and how they unfold. Fourth is the issue of context specificity, and especially when we're looking at the Arab region, where there is actually very varied, let's say, capacities, the resources and performances across countries. There are some countries that, in terms of economic growth and development, they're highly performing. There are others who are fragile and conflict affected. So it's very important to be context specific. And this brings back to the issue of dynamism, which, I mean, it explains how a certain threat, when it happens, I mean, I think COVID is a testament to that. It never plays out the same way in different places. Every place, it plays out in a unique way, because every place is context specific, and this threat, it manifests itself and interacts with vulnerabilities that are already in place and feeds on issues that are already in place. Another important concept is system thinking, and this, I mean, just this, I mean, this is, again, we can talk a lot about this, but I think what's important here to note is that we should not be dealing with the issue of climate change as an isolated issue or in an isolated manner. It interacts with many other issues, with political factors, social, gender, demographic. So there are many other systems that are at play and that climate change interact with. So we should focus on how to understand better this interactivity and how climate-related threats could feed on certain vulnerabilities across different systems. And again, this allows for a better understanding of the notion of cascading risks, of how a certain, again, threat or a crisis, it hits a certain place, and how it brings a cascade of risks. How do we understand this behavior and how this could happen? This concept of system thinking can assist in that. Last but not least, again, I think, no, yes, I still have two last points. Something important to mention also is the level of vulnerability and resilience. So whether on the national, on the government level, or on the individual level, people are impacted differently by climate-related threats based on their level of vulnerability and their ability, again, to cope with these issues. And lastly, I would say it's, again, it's very important to take also a preventative approach to these issues. These risks that are associated with climate change, they are not inevitable. They don't necessarily have to manifest or happen. They can be prevented if interventions, again, are devised early on in a proactive, anticipatory, and preventative manner. And again, I think the climate crisis is another, similar to COVID, a strong reminder of how we have to put prevention center stage to our policies and planning, again, to avoid having to deal with another systemic similar to COVID-19 when it comes to climate change as well. So I'll stop here, and I definitely went over time, but I hope we have some time for questions and discussions as well.
That's fine. Thank you so much, Salma, for that lecture. And I didn't want to stop you because there were quite a lot of great points. So I thought, let it happen, and we can have questions afterwards. So those who have questions to ask Salma, please raise your hands, or you can post the questions in the chat box and I can direct them to Salma. So I can see that there is a question already in the chat box. So this question is by Purnima. She's one of the PhD candidates at the department. She works on the conflict in Yemen, in fact. So she says, thank you so much for the presentation. The Persian Gulf states have been witnessing climate change issues like heat waves and erratic climate conditions. However, owing to continued dependency on oil-generated income, states like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait have been opposing international action against climate change, including policies brought up by Civil Aviation Organization and those related to the Paris Agreement. So what would this kind of approach of these states towards climate change cost the region? Isn't there a need for at least a regional climate change and disaster management mechanism in place in a region like the Persian Gulf?
Yes. Okay, should I take this one?
Yeah, you may. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think definitely it's a problem that many oil-dependent countries face. I mean, including, for instance, Nigeria, which is similar to Saudi Arabia. It's a very oil-dependent countries and depend on the exports and the revenues that they get out of this. And again, these countries, I mean, what they're trying to do is more diversify their economies, so they're not heavily dependent on the oil exports, given that there is already a transition towards renewable energy, and many of their markets, for instance, the European Union already have a Green Deal in place, and they're aiming to phase out fossil fuels completely. So they're losing even these markets that they usually provide them with oil. So I think, yeah, they're moving more towards diversifying, but again, these are structural transformation. I mean, these are massive changes to their economies. So these countries will definitely require, let's say, more time, or will require more time to be able to put these structural transformations in place, to open new economic sectors, and to diversify this economy. But again, I agree with your point that there should be better, let's say, regional cooperation around these issues, which is, again, maybe it's a capacity gap that needs to be better addressed on how can we have better regional mechanisms so we can deal better with the consequences, let's say, of not being able to phase out, let's say, quickly, or that some countries would need more time to be able to do that. Then again, how do we manage the risks of this transition while acknowledging that for some countries it would be much more difficult, will take much longer for them to be able to do that.
Thank you, Salma. We have a question from Teresa. You want to ask directly?
Hi. Am I audible?
Hello. Hi, Teresa. Yes.
Thank you, ma'am, for that presentation. That was very informative. I have two questions for you. Both are pertaining gender. So the first one is, do you think there needs to be some sort of gender mainstreaming within the climate change sphere or climate change mitigation in West Asia and the Arab region? Do you want me to ask the second one, or do you want to answer this one?
No, go ahead, please. Ask the second one.
Okay. The second one is mostly your opinion that I wanted. So basically, women in peace building have often been linked to the narrative of women being inherently peaceful. So do you think that's prevalent? Do you think that's okay, or do you think that there needs to be a change and that we have more to bring to the table rather than being inherently peaceful? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I am glad you asked the one on gender, because this is a very strong area of interest to me personally and to the center as well. I mean, just a couple of months ago, we had a series of workshops on gender, climate, and security, and the interface between these three elements. So definitely, I mean, and there is the need for gender mainstreaming, or there is the need for climate policies and let's say climate-related interventions to take into account what are the specific experiences and needs, not just of women, but again, this should be based on vulnerability and resilience analysis of the communities and the areas where we want to intervene. So who are the most vulnerable? What are the risks they are exposed to? And how do we make sure that this is addressed in policies, in programs, and interventions? But not only vulnerabilities and risks, also women play a positive role. I mean, they contribute to climate adaptation. For instance, women play an integral role in the management and collection of water, a main role in subsistence farming, in collection of firewood and energy sources for their households. So again, they're already they're at the front line and they're playing a positive role. So we can see how can we support them, how we can strengthen again the role in their own communities. So this can be, I mean, this is only possible if there are gender analysis, if we actually conduct some sort of focus groups, we bring these vulnerable or affected communities, talk with them, know what are their needs and their experiences, to be able to mainstream this or to be able to integrate this in our policies and programs, and develop, again, targeted programs that supports specific groups of the communities that are most in need. So that's on the first question. On the second question, on women being portrayed as peaceful, and this being like a pretext, or this is, let's say, the justification of why to include women in peace building because they're peaceful. I mean, I don't know. I don't think this is the right approach to it. I mean, there are women who definitely play a very positive role on local levels and on peace building and in bringing communities together and finding solutions to local problems. And I think what we should focus on is how do we make sure that the voices of these women are heard, that they are provided the support that they need to better contribute to their communities and to addressing, again, let's say, conflict-related threats that they face. But again, I mean, they're also vulnerable to specific issues and conflict areas, and we need to make sure they're protected and there are protection mechanisms in place. There are also provided support for this. So again, I mean, definitely they should not be included because they're perceived as peaceful. They should be included because they have already supported their communities. They have played a positive role and they're capable, I mean, of contributing to this. So it's not a checkbox exercise, but we have to make sure they meaningfully participate and that we meaningfully support them.
Thank you, Salma, for answering both the questions. So there's another question here about initiatives such as Blue Peace. This question comes from Kiran, who is also a second-year student. How successful have initiatives such as Blue Peace been able to address water conflicts in the region? Maybe I'll just probably tag one question to it. How much of these narratives on environmental peace building, that environmental issues can contribute to peace building initiatives. Blue Peace was one of these initiatives, in fact. How do you think they work on the ground, and have they been successful?
Thank you. I mean, definitely, I think there should be better understanding of the issues on the ground, and there should be better inclusion of affected communities, of people at the front line. So these sort of initiatives or programs should be built more on consultative and participatory approaches, where we can see, again, what are the possible, let's say, conflict drivers, or what are the issues that could lead to social tensions and conflict between affected communities, but also what are the opportunities for peace, or how this tensions over natural resources or over environmental related issues can be used as an opportunity to bring these, let's say, communities together, to have intercommunal dialogues. So how can, again, use this challenge and transform it into an opportunity for cooperation, for social cohesion, for building peace across these communities, while definitely, again, having a preventative approach and addressing the root causes, because I mean, in many cases, this has to do with livelihood loss, with, let's say, mismanagement of resources, with the lack of proper governance systems. So also these are root issues that we need to address to ensure that these interventions are successful and that they're sustainable and that they will continue to be in place.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, there's one question from Aishwarya, who's also a second-year student. She has a question based on the weather modification used by countries in this region, like cloud seeding. How far have these mechanisms been able to bring any sort of relief to the countries, including on sustainability concerns? And how does the usage of these technologies may create conflicts among the nations in the region as adoption of such option becomes more common as water scarcity increases? So that's another question.
Thank you. I'm just not very familiar with the, can you mention again the technology? What is it about?
This is weather modification technologies like cloud seeding and others, which are, being used by the countries in the Arab region.
Okay. I have to say I'm not very familiar with them.
Yeah, no problem. One of the things that is often discussed is that as countries become more water scarce, they would use cloud seeding techniques to increase rainfall in a region. And Arab countries have been using these techniques, especially the richer ones, for a long time. And this has also possibility of, say, increasing conflicts in the region, because other countries may accuse that this country is, basically stealing their clouds. Something that is being discussed. But it's fine. That was also one of the questions. Are there any? Yeah, sorry.
No, I just say I think it's interesting example, and this is actually something as a center we're interested in, of looking of how, again, this transition to sustainable energy and dealing even with the climate crisis and the climate threat, what sort of risks and challenges that it could bring to the region. And I mean, using a certain technology that might have a negative consequences on other countries, and how this might contribute to tensions, let's say, between these countries. So I think it's very interesting to look on how the transition to renewables, how, again, there's maladaptation. I mean, we could adapt to climate change while causing many other problems. So also that we keep in mind that those interventions, those technologies we decide to use, those interventions that we will be taking place, that they put in mind what could be their possible, let's say, negative consequences and risks that they might entail.
Okay, thank you, Salma. We are on dot as far as time is concerned. Are there any other questions that you would like to ask Salma among the students? Any other further questions or any comments, anything else? Okay, I don't see any hands up. So I think maybe, you know, it's we can kind of conclude the program here, since, you know, I had asked 1 hour from you, and you covered so many aspects which are so interesting, also using case studies, which is very important, because very often we treat this entire region as some kind of a monolith without really recognizing the ground realities and how climate change and other issues sort of interact with each other, you know, which is something that you mentioned through the systems thinking and how the correlations can be built. And these are some of the lessons which is important, not just from a climate change perspective. I feel this is very important for any conflict researcher in general, you know, because we often have a very reductionist idea of how conflicts are generated. And I think these are the kind of lessons which need to be imbibed in conflict studies as well. So thank you so much, Salma, for giving that lecture. And I hope that okay, I'm sorry for that. Somebody just unmuted there. So thank you so much, Salma, on behalf of the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and UNESCO Peace Chair, as well as Center for Climate Studies. I would like to formally thank you for accepting our invitation to deliver this lecture and answering all the questions in detail, very patiently, and also talking about various aspects in such detailed manner, because as I mentioned, these are issues that require much deeper analysis. We can't just have a you know, like a superficial idea of how things work. And since you have such wide experience of working in the region, dealing with communities who often get ignored in conflict analysis in international relations, it's very important that we look at the role of communities, the role of women, role of various other actors who have as much agency in the processes of peacekeeping and peace building and peacemaking. So thank you so much. I would also like to thank all the other faculty at the department and also the students for joining at this hour, because this is actually after class hours. So I was a little worried that a lot of students might be exhausted as usual, but they, you know, most of them have joined, which is great. So I hope this was also very informative and helpful for all the students. Thank you, Salma, and hope to see you again. And if you happen to visit India anytime, please visit Manipal as well.
Thank you very much. The pleasure is all mine, and I definitely hope to see you soon as well.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. Bye-bye.